Hi, Gabor. My name's Mariana Harris, and we have with us about 65 people from across Canada who, oh, right, there we go. We have 65 people from across Canada who are all committed to working on Palestinian human rights.
Yeah.
So we're very pleased to be able to talk with you today. I was going to ask you a few questions, and then they may ask you some questions.
Sure.
I think that you and I went to UBC about the same time.
You must be old.
I am. We had very different backgrounds and histories, and I think our lives have taken different courses. And yet we end up both speaking up for Palestinian human rights. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today. I wonder if you could begin by telling us about your family history and their experiences, how you responded to that history, being Jewish and born in the 1940s in Hungary, how you saw the world. That'd be great for a start.
Yeah, so I was born in January 1944 in Budapest, which is, Hungary was an ally of Germany in the Second World War. But in the beginning of 44, they began to develop cold feet about the possibility of where this war was going. So there was talk of Hungary withdrawing from the alliance. The Germans, as a result, occupied the country militarily when I was 2 months of age in March. And the Hungarian Jewish community at that time was the only large Jewish community still intact, because everywhere else, the Germans had largely exterminated the Jewish population, as everybody knows. Now it was Hungary's turn. So between March and June, they had the most successful operation in the whole genocidal history, managing to deport and kill within the space of a few months 500,000 or more Jews from what was Hungary at that time. My mother and I lived in Budapest, which is in the center of the country, and that's helped us survive because as the Germans, they performed the deportations to Auschwitz and elsewhere from the circumference in towards the center. By the time they got towards the center, there was such a world international outcry about what was happening. The Pope spoke out, the American president spoke out, that the Hungarian government, which had been cooperating with the Germans, put a stop to them. And then in October or November, a far right-wing fascist proto-Nazi Hungarian movement took over the power when the killings of Jews in Budapest now began. So that's how my mother and I spent the first year of my life. And then my father was in forced labor. My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz when I was 5 months of age. And that shaped my childhood and our family's emotional history. In Hungary, I was subjected to anti-Semitism as a kid. There were incidents. I had to change classes at some point. So I grew up. There's an American psychologist called, a Black American psychologist called Kenneth Hardy, and he talks about the assaulted sense of self, where the abused or the racially abused takes on the view of them, of the oppressor. So I took on a negative view of being Jewish, and I was ashamed of being Jewish until I became a Zionist here in Canada in my 16, 17 years of age. I read the book Exodus by Leon Uris, which is a big popular novel then and subsequently a novel. It's vicious, chauvinist propaganda full of lies. But to my heart, it was a balm, because here were the heroic Jews fighting off the evil Arabs. Now we're no longer victims. Now we're a powerful people asserting our rights in our ancient homeland. It really was a liberation for me. And I joined the Zionist movement. I became a Zionist youth leader. And then when the Vietnam War happened, I started to ask questions. Why is the same media that is supporting the mass slaughter of Vietnamese also so supportive of Israel? Like, what's the connection here? And then the 67 war happened, and I actually volunteered to go at that time to Israel to serve, to let other people be free to join the army. So a lot of young Jews went to Israel then. My visa didn't come through in time, so I didn't end up going. But pretty quickly, it became apparent to me that that war had been fought quite deliberately and propagated or prepared and provoked by the Israelis in order to grab territory. And in 67, in the fall, I did all the research and I wrote an article in the student newspaper saying this was not a war of defense, it was a war of aggression. The intention was to capture territory, and Israel will never give back those territories. I did that in 1967, as a result of which my father kicked me out of our house, which I could understand because him being a survivor, I was being a traitor to my people. My father eventually came around and joined this group called Jews for a Just Peace that I had helped to found, and he began to see the light, which was a real tribute to him, because for many Jewish people, seeing reality is impossible because it's too painful for them to acknowledge that our so-called liberation occurred at the expense of another people. Now, that history has been documented by Israeli historians. It's not even in doubt that beginning in 1947, there were deliberate house demolitions on a massive scale, mass killings, intimidation of Arab population with the intent of having them leave so that the land and the homes can be given to Jewish immigrants. And in Israel today, you can go from kibbutz to kibbutz and town to town. And what you don't know is you're standing on the graves of Palestinians or on the demolished homes where they used to live. I visited the occupied territories during the first Intifada. I cried every day for 2 weeks at what I saw. It's much worse now. And let me just close my remarks by saying that, but at least this answer, by telling you that I'm really glad to be talking to non-Jews about this because there's such an attempt to intimidate you, to tar you with the brush of anti-Semitism. It's such a slander. It's so false. And yet, given the terrible history of Jewish persecution over the centuries, and especially, the German genocide, people are so afraid of being labeled anti-Semites. And I was once asked in an interview if I was pro-Palestinian, and I said, no, I'm pro-truth. And it's not a question of being pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli. It's a question of, are you in favor of justice? Are you in favor of truth? Are you in favor of the facts? Are you in favor of equality? Are you in favor of freedom for everyone? So be proud that that's what you're on the side of. And don't for a moment allow yourself to be calumniated or intimidated. Okay.
When I heard you in an interview with your son, you were talking about disillusionment and the importance of going through that during the course of one's life. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that idea about disillusionment.
Yeah. So first of all, actually, disillusionment, if I can beat my own drum here for a moment, I've just written a new book. It'll be published in the fall. It's called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And in the very last chapter, I talk about disillusionment, including this one. And the people say, I've been disillusioned. And I say to them, would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned? Would you rather hold on to a false and distorted view of the world, or would you rather be related to reality the way it actually is? So, growing up in Hungary, I was a dutiful young communist. Then the Hungarian Revolution broke out, and all of a sudden the scales fell from my eyes, and I saw what an oppressive system I had believed in. And then we come to the West, and then I looked on the United States as the shining city on the hill. And then I see them slaughtering millions of people and dropping chemical weapons and napalm on innocents in the name of a pack of lies that were easily transparent and subsequently exposed, and the media cheering it on. When Martin Luther King criticized the American war against the Vietnamese, the New York Times said that now he stepped over the line. So that was another disillusionment. And then the one I already mentioned, my belief, my really fervent hope of this miracle of Israel being reborn in the homeland. I had to let go of that illusion as well. And you know what? Every disillusionment liberates you. So be glad when you're disillusioned.
Oh, thank you for that, because there's been times when I've been feeling disillusioned recently.
What are you disillusioned about?
I think it would be better not to say in this audience.
Okay.
We had an experience in the last couple of weeks that was pretty disillusioning.
Well, so let me tell you, I don't know what the incident was. You don't have to tell me, but what I can tell you is that in this culture, the Zionist lobby has incredible power. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories here. I'm not saying the Jews rule the world. They don't. I wish we did, you know, that I could be part of the ruling class, you know, but the Zionist lobby is extraordinarily powerful. Huge donations to the political parties, which gives them tremendous power, and they really encourage a climate of intimidation. So it's happened to me a number of times that the CBC would invite me to go on a program, and then the Zionist lobby would put their foot down, and all of a sudden the invitation disappears. And these are people with good principles and so on. They just haven't got the courage. Now, I don't know what you were subjected to, but I imagine that what happened to you occurred in that atmosphere of people being intimidated and compromising their principles.
So someone told us a story earlier today, and I wonder if she could just come here and tell it to us again. Her name's Dalita, and she's part of a movement at Carleton University, and there was some very disillusioning things to hear about that. Dalita,
Yeah.
can you come up and tell him? Maybe if you go around there.
Well, you should just come
About how you guys were stopped from
go ahead,
doing
yeah.
the work you were doing. Oh, take your mask off.
Hi.
Hi. So the thing is, we used to do so many activities related to Palestine, just trying to make people acknowledge what's going on there and have some sense, like the right thing to do. Sorry. So right now, unfortunately, the university is trying to shut us down. We have had many complaints from other universities as well about our activities, even though everything we do was peaceful. We've never meant any harm for anyone. And the Israeli Student Association has actually filed a lawsuit against us, stating that we have done so many harm and we are encouraging violence against them. But the problem is they're the ones who are doing that, but no one is trying to stop them. No one is trying to make things right. And it's just it's disappointing to see how they are getting so much support for what they're doing, even though it's so obvious for everyone that it's just the opposite that's going on. We have had also the Israeli Students Associations trying to get involved into violence actions against us, especially during our protests and rallies in Parliament House. And yeah, now we're trying to fight that, even though we can't actually do anything. Our movement now is so limited, and it feels like we are trapped. We're imprisoned. We can't talk, we can't do our activities, and we have to stay sit in our places and shut our mouths out.
Yeah, it's an appalling situation. Here's the deal. Russia invaded Ukraine. Without getting to the politics of it, people are being killed. It's a terrible thing. needless to say, the history is not the way the Western press presents it. It never is. But doesn't matter what the history is. The invasion is terrible. It's murderous. Innocent people are suffering as a result. Immediately, Russia gets sanctioned. Sanctions. Everybody's in favor. Russian players can't, tennis players can't play at Wimbledon this year. Nobody sanctioned the United States when they killed 500,000 people in Iraq. The Israelis can bomb 600 Gazan children to death in their homes, and to talk about BDS makes you an anti-Semite. So there's a terrible, appalling double standard here, and they're going to use everything in their power to crush you. There's nothing fair about it. The university administrations are deaf, dumb, and blind, because where does their money come from? Rich donors. And unfortunately, there's a lot more Jewish rich donors than Palestinian rich donors. So your solution is to become really rich, multi-billionaires.
There you go, Delita.
It's very simple. Just do it, and then you'll have no more problem. Now, and it's not only the rich donors. And by the way, the richer people are, the more right-wing they tend to be. So that the Zionist lobby does not represent the whole Jewish community. There's much more nuanced and debate and mixed feelings in the Jewish community, but they speak for the community as if they actually own the community. And that's the nature of money in this culture. That's not a Jewish problem. That's a problem of capitalism. But the impact is that you're up against forces that won't even identify themselves, but they have tremendous power. And then there's this whole ideology that people have bought into of criticizing Israel as anti-Semitic. If you read Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, there's an article today by Gideon Levy about a Palestinian family that was attacked and injured in their own fields by a bunch of settlers. Then they get arrested for throwing stones back. Now, do you think you'll read that story in the Global Mail tomorrow? Do you think you'll read it in the Toronto Star? Do you think the CBC will? No, if it was a Ukrainian situation, you would hear about it. So the decision makers at universities are not only, it's not just a financial thing, it's also an ideological thing of the atmosphere that the Western media and the protective shield that the Western media has created around Israel. So therefore, you people who are trying to just tell the truth about your experience, and not just the historical experience, but the ongoing daily experience, you're seen as the aggressors. Oh, Jewish people don't feel safe on the campus. Why? Because somebody's telling the truth. So all I can tell you is keep struggling and keep expecting to be squashed, because that's what they're going to try and do every time.
How do you imagine change coming about did I turn it off? Okay. How do you imagine change coming about in the relationship between Israel and Palestinians, or can you imagine that?
Look, I know really great Israelis who are doing their best to be in touch with Palestinians, to support them, to advocate for them, to join them in their struggles. So on a one-to-one or small group level, that is happening amongst a very small group of conscious Israelis. All of you will know the work of Ilan Pappé, the Israeli historian. The biggest prison on earth, which is about the bureaucratic, Nazi-like cunning of the occupation. His work, 10 Myths About Israel, the work of Norman Finkelstein on Gaza and so on. These are Jewish scholars who have demonstrated and documented all this stuff. They can't be accused of anti-Semitism. They can just be accused, like me, of self-hatred, but not of anti-Semitism as such. But on the whole, on the larger level, I don't see much change coming, and I'll tell you why not. Because Israel, like Canada, is a colonial settler state. And you see, it's legal and it's illegal in Canada to deny the Holocaust, but it's not illegal to deny the genocide of our Indigenous people. People like Conrad Black, who shall remain unnamed, you know, a twisted-minded, traumatized fellow like him can write articles and does in the National Post denigrating the native experience and denying it and saying no big deal happened here. Try saying that about the Jews in Europe. You'll be in jail. So there's an incredible double standard. Why? Because Canada is a colonial country. So is Israel. And Israel is in a stage of colonialism of continued expansion and land grab and acquisition and oppression. So is Canada. But that colonial work has been largely done in the past. We still see it happening when it comes to resources and forests and so on. That's why there's never been a full settlement of native issues in Canada. It's also the same reason why there's not a full settlement of that issue in Israel, because you're not going to settle with people whose lands you're still settling. It's that simple. I don't see anything happening in the short term. In the long term, it's going to be at some point, nothing is stable. No empire lasts forever. No system lasts forever. And the work that you're doing needs to be understood, not just for the immediate good that you're doing, which even if you don't succeed, you're still providing support to a people under siege, which is immensely important from the point of view of morale. But you're also contributing to a long-term awareness of a situation that cannot be sustained. When it'll end, I don't know. I don't see any short-term I don't see too much positive happening in the short term.
Okay. I wonder if questions have come to other people they'd like to come and ask Gabor. They're all totally in agreement with you. Yes.
Either that or they're dumbfounded. I don't know.
Just a minute, here's somebody coming.
Thank you so much. We were talking in our small group after the, okay. We were in small groups before you came on, and we were talking about the challenge of addressing every time you try and engage with a Zionist Jew around the Holocaust lived experience and how they aren't safe until they're back in Israel. So one of the questions that arises for me after that conversation, hearing you speak, is how do you see the Jewish community moving beyond the Holocaust experience and addressing the trauma that you speak so eloquently about?
You know, I didn't, I'm not actually, probably if you look towards me and spoke in this direction.
No, this way.
Oh,
This is
Okay.
where he is.
No, would you?
Okay, I'm technologically challenged, obviously.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Sorry, which part? Do you want me to repeat the whole thing?
The last part. How do you do what? How do
Oh,
you?
so how do you envision, as the Jewish message is always, we've got the Holocaust trauma, and
Yeah.
because of that, we need a safe place. And in your work around trauma, you're always talking about that we need to address the trauma. Do you see any hope that that's going to happen?
Look, if people are going to be defining themselves as victims, there's not much you can do for them. But you know, the problem is that this argument is not an intellectual question; it's an emotional question. And some people are so heavily identified with the powerful Jewish state that they don't know who they are without it. Now, you can't shake people loose from their identification. That's an emotional issue. It's got nothing to do with rationality. In terms of rationality, that position doesn't have any. Number one, if they need a place to stay safe and they think Israel is the place, why don't they move there? Why don't others, you know, next year in Jerusalem? How about tomorrow in Jerusalem? You know, you could get on a plane tomorrow, and by the day after, you'd be an Israeli citizen. If you really believe that, do it. If you don't do it, you don't believe it. Number one. Number two, in which country is it safer to be a Jew, Canada or Israel? Because of the conflict over there. Where is your child more likely to have to go into the army and be killed? Where are you going to be more likely to be subjected to like today, 3 Israelis died in a terrorist attack. Is it really that safe? And is it really right to take land from some other people to ensure your own safety? Is that actually right? Is that what you want to do? And furthermore, what does the demolition of Palestinian homes and the cutting down of Palestinian olive groves and the water distribution in the West Bank, where the settlers have access to 6 times as much water per capita as the Palestinians do, what does that have to do with Jewish safety? So on any rational ground, it's easy to talk, but the problem is an emotional one. What I can tell you is that as the generations grow younger, the identification with Israel gets weaker and weaker. And that's one of the reasons why they've ratcheted up the anti-Semitic calumny these days, because they're losing their battle even in their own communities. That young Jews are far more likely to question the occupation and the rationale behind it. But those that are, look, people are legitimately traumatized. I mean, there's no greater historical trauma than the Holocaust. And those that are affected by it either directly or multi-generational through their families, and who haven't worked through that trauma, you just have to, you know what, don't be hostile to them. They can't help it. Just don't let their pain intimidate you.
Interesting. Okay, there's somebody else that's going to come forward and ask a question.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. So I'd like to ask you, out of your work and experience, how do you explain what I believe is the great divide in the Jewish community and the Jewish people? Is the great majority who say never again, the tiny minority that says never again for anyone.
Yeah, well, that's the key point. And you know, never again could be like, we'll never allow this stuff to happen again to us, or that human beings should never behave that way to other people like that. Again, that's a matter of emotionality and identification. And those that have a tribal definition of, so never again is not a tribal slogan, not if it's properly understood. And to their credit, there are plenty of Holocaust survivors who have actually said so, that whatever you're doing, when you're destroying Palestinian homes, you're not doing it in my name. There are people like that still all around. So they've taken the humane sense of never again. But those that are attached to the tribal version of it, there's not much you can say to them. Now, what you can do is, if both parties are open to it, have a conversation when you're not debating, because these debates just don't get anywhere. But are you willing to hear what I have to say? Am I willing to hear what you have to say? If you can get into those conversations without any agenda that you're going to win the debate or convince anybody of anything, if you can really listen to the person's pain and perspective, and if they're willing to hear yours, you'll achieve something that'll have long-term positive consequences, if not immediate ones. That's the best you can do. But most of the time, people are so emotional and they're so afraid to become disillusioned, is what it actually is, that they don't open to that kind of conversation. And you know, these days, there's a lot of talk about the cancel culture. the cancel culture. You know what the original cancel culture was? People who criticize Israel. They wouldn't be allowed on the media, forbidden academic platforms. That was the original cancel. We forget that. People think that cancel culture is sort of a left-wing concoction or a left-wing dynamic. It isn't. McCarthyism came long before cancel culture. Zionist McCarthyism came long before. Norman Finkelstein, who is a wonderful Jewish scholar, he writes about Gaza. His book is This Time We Went Too Far. His parents were Holocaust survivors. He lost his position as a tenured professor, even though he was highly respected, well-published, and loved by his students. But he was turfed out of his position, didn't get tenure precisely because of his position in Israel. That's cancel culture.
Right. One more, Shadi. Next.
I'm glad that you brought up this question about cancel culture. What would your professional opinion be about Israel's role in normalizing the abnormal?
Well, I'm sure you mean something by it, but I'm afraid I don't agree with you.
Oh,
No, there's nothing abnormal about what Israel is doing. What Israel is doing is what colonialists have always done. The Belgians in the early 20th century, late 19th, killed 12 million Congolese. Do we even hear about it in our schools? The Americans killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos in the late 1990s, late 1890s, I should say. Never mind the genocide here in North America. The Dutch, after the Second World War, you know how many Indonesians the Dutch killed? And when they tried to regain their Indonesian colony, 250,000. So Israel is not normalizing the abnormal. Israel is doing the normal, what colonialists always do. That's what they're doing.
Okay, I think we have another question here. So look at this.
Does anybody know how many Guatemalans were massacred in the 1990s, 25 years ago?
Does anybody know?
I think about 10,000.
10,000?
No,
200,000?
100,000.
100,000?
By an army trained by the Americans, by an army trained by the Americans and the Israelis. Massacre 100,000 of the indigenous population. Do you even hear about it in the newspapers? Does anybody ever talk about it? It doesn't exist. It's perfectly normal in a sense that this is the norm of colonial societies.
Recently, I heard that your son is doing some really good work. I think he has a program called Pushback.
Yes.
I wonder if you could speak to that. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Speak about what, my son's program?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So I'm always happy to be a nepotistic father. My son Aaron, who lives in New York, is an independent journalist. He won a Izzy Stone Award for independent journalism, investigative journalism, because of the exposure of the Russiagate concoction. And he's done wonderful work on the Ukraine situation. He's not in favor of the Russian invasion, but he points out the NATO role in pushing the Russians to the brink. He's got a program called Pushback, which is part of a larger platform called the Gray Zone. And so you can just Google on YouTube, Aaron Mate Pushback, and he's really worth following because you're going to get interviews and facts and articles that you're just not going to get in the mainstream press. And he's got a lot of integrity, a lot of presence as well. So he's really worth watching. Thank you for mentioning him. His Pushback with Aaron Mate. And there's an interview with my son, Aaron, and I on the Palestine-Israel issue. You can Google Aaron and Gabor Mate on Palestine or anti-Semitism, actually. And you hear a very long and I think not very long, but an extended and I think quite engaging discussion about this whole issue of Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about Jewish fear of annihilation and how Israel abuses it over and over again to kind of justify certain actions and
Jewish,
certain actions against
I'm sorry, Jewish what?
fear of annihilation.
Fear of annihilation?
Yeah. You know, persecution, 2,000 years of pogroms and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, you know, the main answer for why there's no peace with the neighbors of Israel is because there's always an enemy, right? So whatever.
Yeah, well, look, so here's the thing. That whole thing that Jews have been persecuted forever is a certain point of view. Now, if you read the Bible, the 5 books of Moses is a genocidal document.
Yep.
Because God threatens to punish the Jews for not killing all the inhabitants of Palestine. That's in our holy books. And Moses has to plead with God not to do it. You know, and so not only that, one of our holidays, you know, Purim, celebrates a much later event that happened in the Persian Empire, where Jewish allied forces killed tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Persians. So I'm not saying that we're villains. I'm saying that we're a part of history. Now, it's certainly true that in Christian countries especially, in the name of the sweet, loving Lord Jesus, Jews were massacred and persecuted. But to say simply that that's all there is to Jewish history is inaccurate. So we've both been perpetrators and victims. Every people is just as capable of being a victim and a perpetrator. I don't have a fear of annihilation. I do climate change, you know, or nuclear war. But actually, I won't walk around with the fear either, but those are distinct possibilities. Jewish annihilation, the Nazi attempt was an attempt to annihilate Jews, and it was highly successful, but of course it could never succeed because not all the Jews lived in Europe. And previous anti-Semitisms weren't attempts to annihilate Jews. They were attempts to keep them in their place, to oppress them, to exploit them. But annihilation wasn't the issue. So historically, it just doesn't make any sense to me. I understand it emotionally, based on what happened in Germany from the mid-30s until the end of the Second World War, but particularly in the years 1941 to 1945. But that doesn't characterize Jewish history.
Then if we connect it, because that's always the response I hear when you talk about peace, is kind of that Israelis are driven by fear, but fear of peace rather than.
Yeah, so how much sense does that make? There's Israel was one of the world's pound for pound, Israel the most powerful military in the whole world. And Israel is armed with nuclear weapons, which neighbors are not allowed to have. You know, Iran can't have nuclear weapons, but it's perfectly okay for Israel to have nuclear weapons. And that country is in fear. That country has killed 20,000 Lebanese civilians in the 1982 war. It has massacred Gazans at will. They don't, you know, the Gazans don't have drones and helicopters and airplanes and anti-aircraft machinery. They're just sitting ducks every time Israel decides to launch another assault. And we're afraid. It's got nothing to do with reality. It has to do with the fear of any colonialists that the oppressed may rise up and fight back. It's that simple. And again, here in North America, are we really afraid of annihilation? We're one of the most successful ethnic communities in the country. I don't walk around being afraid of being annihilated for being Jewish. And I don't think anybody does reasonably. If they do, it's an emotional identification.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, here comes someone. This is one of the people that's been doing all the background work for this conference and driving us around and picking us up. He's great.
Nice. Hi.
Hi, it's very common that individuals who are abused when they're young, maybe grow up to become abusers.
Yeah.
Is it possible that the same thing can happen at the level of a people who are historically abused, who later in their history become abusers of other people with less power than them? Is it a similar phenomenon?
Yeah. That's certainly a factor. So that when you read histories of the war in 1948, a lot of the people that fought in the war on the Jewish side were as refugees from Europe, and they actually saw the Arabs as sort of reincarnation of the Nazis. So basically, they were fighting back against their own trauma, and furthermore, filled with rage and fear, you'll act out that rage and fear in others. So that was part of the dynamic. But that doesn't explain what's happening anymore, because because if you look at any colonial situation, if you look at South Africa, or if you look at the Spanish invasion of the Americas, or for that matter, the English invasion of the Americas, it wasn't a question of a traumatized people. It was a question of a people seeking colonial expansion, and colonialism will make you dehumanize the other person, whether you're traumatized or not. Once you become a colonialist, you have to convince yourself of your right to the land and of the less than human nature of the people from whom you're taking the land. That's a bigger dynamic in Israel than the Holocaust trauma. On individual subjective level, no, of course, Israeli historiography and propaganda keep exaggerating the Holocaust, and they keep presenting Israel as the antidote to the Holocaust. That's just clever propaganda. But what's driving the current policies is not trauma, it's colonialism. It's pure and simple.
You would think that when someone is abused, they would think, this is horrible. I would never want to do this to anybody.
That's
It
not
work that way.
That's not how it works. All the major killers, serial killers or abusers of children are traumatized children themselves. So that trauma, unless you work it through, can actually distort your thinking, and you can become very cruel and inhumane, and your heart is completely shut down as a result of trauma. So it doesn't follow. It's logical to say, as you say, that you think it was done to you, you wouldn't do it to others. It's logical, but psychologically, that's not necessarily how it works. It can enrage you, it can envenom you, it can make you very narcissistic, in which case you become president of the United States.
I just want to thank you so much. I really appreciate you keeping going back to the colonial viewpoint of this.
Yeah.
Because I think it puts it in line with all of us, right? That we have acted that way, or our ancestors have acted that way. And,
Yes.
and I really appreciate you saying it's not abnormal. It's what goes with colonialism. That is very helpful to me.
Mm.
There was something else you said that was, but my mind doesn't sort of hold on to things too long. But I think everybody here has been very touched by what you said. Oh, I know, you were talking about closed hearts.
Yeah.
Or open hearts. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to do here is work on being compassionate and your open heart.
Yeah.
That's one way that you can make a certain amount of change, is that opening.
And I would suggest that you keep that open heart as much as possible, even to those who are trying to stop you. Don't let them stop you, but don't take it personally. And also, they're coming from some distorted view of the world. You know, they're not deliberately trying to do evil. they do perpetrate evil, but they don't try deliberately to do it. So be steadfast and firm, but still open-hearted. That's a tough balancing act. Believe me, I know personally. I can generate so much rage around this issue. In fact, I have, which wasn't very helpful. So stay open-hearted, but stay very clear-headed at the same time. That's the trick.
Is indeed the trick. So thank you very much. Can you give them?
Thank you. All right, goodbye.
We very much appreciate your time with us. So thank you.
Yeah.
And I hope
Thank
things are going well for you. Okay.
Thank you. Okay,
Bye.
take care. Bye-bye.